is with great pleasure that I am welcoming you to this event, which is the second of our Social Sciences Occasion Lectures of the 2015-16 season. And for one thing, well, some of you know who I am, some of you do not, so I better tell you that my name is Nina Rosenstand, and I'm a professor of philosophy here. And I am chairing this series and have been for many years. So that means that I can now introduce today's speaker, and this is Professor Justin Estep, who is Professor of Psychology here at Mesa, and this is his second year as a psychology professor. And he got his PhD at UC Riverside, and he is now working on putting his dissertation together as a published work. And his main interest is within the field of learning and working memory. So you have the title of his talk here, Psychology and Instruction, Professor Justin Estep.
All right, so thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. Today I'm going to be talking about psychology and instruction. First, I'm going to do a little bit of background and a couple demonstrations of just some points that I kind of wanted to get across. Then I'll talk about different things that we can learn about instruction from a little bit from research methods, from what we know about memory, cognitive load, reading, experience and expertise, and then finally from category learning. My goals for this lecture are for you to learn a little bit about psychology, to learn a little bit about instruction, and to learn a little bit about me. So these are the things that I want you to learn a little bit about. When I talk about instruction, this works from both sides. So if you are instructing, right, if you're providing instruction, this is stuff that's going to help you. But it's also going to help you if you're a learner, right? So it's going to help you from sort of both sides. Because some of this material you have control over, no matter which side of the table you're on. Okay, so firstly, what is psychology? So I know a lot of you are not psychology people, some of you are. But psychology is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. It's empirical. What I mean by that is that it requires evidence, and we're going to be testing hypotheses. And it's also very broad, right? So although the core interest in psychology is behavior, it's going to encompass behaviors, but also everything that influences behaviors from biology to society and everything in between. Okay, so how does psychology inform instruction? Well, one of the reasons it can inform instruction is because it's so broad. Okay, so some things that are studied in psychology would be things like learning and memory, and those are two of the main things that I'm going to be focusing on in this lecture. But psychology also studies things like motivation, interpersonal communication, persuasion, which are all also relevant to instruction. I'm going to be focusing more on the learning and memory types of things. But just to give you an idea of how psychology is able to tell us a bit about instruction. Okay, so firstly, I want to do a quick demonstration. So this task is if a card has a vowel on it, it has an odd number on the other side. And you're supposed to determine which two cards need to be flipped over in order to make sure that this rule is true. Okay? So the rule that I'm saying is if it has a vowel on it, it has to have an odd number on the other side. Which two cards do you need to flip over? Okay? So I'll give you guys a quick second. And then just by show of hands, I'll ask you for each of the two cards that you think need to be flipped over. So you can vote twice because you'll want to flip two cards over. Okay? So how many people would want to flip that A card over? Okay? How many people want to flip the J card over? How many people want to flip the 18 over? And how many people want to flip the 27 over? Okay? So I'm not going to tell you guys the answer quite yet, because I want to ask you another question. So if a person is drinking alcohol, they must be at least 21 years of age. Which two people should be checked? And so we have these four people. One of them is drinking alcohol. One of them is drinking juice. One of them is 18 years old. And one of them is 27 years old. Okay, so again, by show of hands, how many people want to check the age of the person who's drinking alcohol? How many people want to check the age of the person who's drinking juice? How many people want to look at the drink that the 18-year-old is drinking? How many people want to look at the drink that the 27-year-old is drinking? Okay? So these questions are actually the same question. The first part is what's called the Wason selection task. Which cards do most people select? They select the vowel, right? So they select the A, and which other one do they tend to select? The odd number, right? So they tend to pick the vowel and the odd number, so they would pick the A and the 27. So the idea is here, these are actually the same questions, right? So whether it's an A, a J, an 18, and a 27, or if it's an alcohol, juice, an 18, and a 27, it's the same two people or cards that you have to pick, right? You have to pick the A card and the 18 card, or you have to pick the alcohol card and the 18 card. It's a lot easier to explain on this one, but I'll go back and explain with the other one too, right? Do we care what the 27-year-old's drinking? We don't, right? So they could be drinking alcohol or juice, that's fine. The 18-year-old, however, cannot be drinking what? They can't be drinking alcohol, or else they're violating this rule, right? Same kind of thing in this scenario, right? If a card has a vowel in it, it has an odd number on the other side. So the A needs to have an odd number on the other side. The 18 can't have a vowel on the other side. Because if it had a vowel on the other side, it would be breaking this rule. The 27, it actually doesn't matter what's on the other side of it, right? It doesn't say if it's an odd number, it has to have a vowel. It says if it's a vowel, it has to have an odd number, right? And so these are really the same question, but people do much better when it's asked in this way, right? When they're asked about the alcohol, juice, 1827, people do much better on this question. When they're asked with this AJ 1827, there was actually only one person who chose the 18, right? People do much worse on this question when it's asked this way. So evolutionary psychologists discovered that the concrete version is very easy. So the concrete version is the one that was the alcohol, juice, 1827. The abstract version is very difficult, right? Very few people are able to solve the question correctly when it's phrased as just A, J, 18, and 27. That's much, much harder for people. The abstract version is also correlated with IQ. However, most people, even with high IQs, don't do very well on that question. Okay? So which will your students or audience understand better? If we give abstract statements or if we give concrete examples? Concrete, right? And so that's kind of the point that I wanted to get across here, right? Is that it's very important to be concrete. Makes things a lot easier for people to understand, right? So me saying abstract and concrete is fine. I could have discussed this whole scenario just saying abstract versus concrete and how concrete is more easily understood than abstract. However, showing you the AJ 1827 versus the alcohol juice 1827 gives you an example of what abstract looks like and what concrete looks like. So I'm trying to be concrete explaining the difference between abstract and concrete. Okay? So concreteness and concrete examples are very valuable, right? Those are very helpful for us better understanding. Context also matters, right? So it was really the same situation, but it was phrased in a different context. And so that's an important thing to pay attention to. I have one more demonstration. The next demonstration comes with a seizure warning. I've never actually had anyone have any problems, but if you are prone to seizures, you may want to look away for a short bit. And I will tell you when you can look again. Okay? So if you're prone to seizures, please look away now. And I'm sorry that you can't benefit from this demonstration. Okay? Everyone ready? Okay. So in this next image that I'm about to show, there's going to be something that's changing. And when you can detect what's changing in the image, I want you to raise your hand. Okay, so when you detect what's changing, go ahead and raise your hand. Give you guys a couple seconds, or many seconds. Okay. All right, so I'll show you what was changing if you weren't able to see. So this is one of the images that's being shown, and this is the other image that's being shown. And so what's changing between these two images? The trees. Okay, and so now this is, I'm going back to the flashing one, just warning. So now you can probably detect that very easily, right? It's now pretty clear what's changing between the images. Okay. So this demonstrates change blindness in the role of something that's called the sensory store. Sensory store is a form of memory that's very, very limited, and it's specific to a modality. By that, what I mean is we have one for vision, we have one for hearing, we have one for each of our different senses. But the sensory store can basically hold one image, okay? And so when I'm showing you the two pictures, one right after the other, kind of like this image is in your sensory store when you see this image, and so making that comparison is extremely easy. What was in your sensory store when I had the flashing images? Does anyone know what was extra? It wasn't switching back and forth between these two images. There was a blank screen in between, right? And so when you're seeing this image, the blank screen is in your sensory store when you get to this image. And so that's not helpful for making that comparison, okay? But the reason I showed you isn't actually for that demonstration. The reason why I showed you this is for a different demonstration. So hopefully what this demonstrated is a change from not getting it to getting it, right? Before you saw the bush, it was probably extremely difficult and maybe a little frustrating, and that's okay. I like making you guys frustrated. It's kind of fun. But it was maybe a little frustrating trying to figure out what was changing in that image when you couldn't see it. Then, how do you feel once you see it? Once you see it, it feels really obvious, right? It feels like, how is everyone not immediately getting this? How did I not immediately get this? And so I feel like that's a really important experience because that's something that happens to us all the time, right? We have that sort of change from getting it, or from not getting it to getting it, and we kind of forget what it was like before we got it, right? So the idea is your experience before you saw the bushes was, this is very hard and I'm not seeing it. But then as soon as you do see it, it's like, this is so easy, I don't get why everyone isn't seeing it immediately, okay? So imagine a topic on which you're an expert, right? That's kind of how you feel about it, right? On that topic, you've sort of seen the bushes, right? And so from your perspective, it's all very easy and very obvious, but it isn't necessarily to other people. So if you're thinking about students, right? If you're teaching this topic to other people, they haven't seen the bushes yet, right? So they don't yet see it, and it might seem obvious from your perspective because you now get it, but it's not necessarily obvious from their perspective. And I think that it's important to remember that. All right, so wanted to talk about different areas in psychology that are informative about instruction. The first one that I decided to talk about was actually research methods. And I decided to start there because it's kind of an unexpected place to learn about instruction. So how on earth are research methods helpful for instruction? Well, it turns out that they apply well to assessments of instruction. So one of the places where they're useful is they help how you think about how learning is assessed. Okay? So there's something called content validity. The idea with validity is that we're ensuring that we're measuring what we're trying to measure. That's the idea of validity. And one way that you can demonstrate that you're measuring what you're trying to measure is through something called content validity. And the idea there is that you have content validity if you're sampling what you're trying to measure well. So you're getting all of the pieces that you're trying to measure, and you're not getting anything extra. So the idea is, if you're being tested on psychology, it should include all areas of psychology that we're taught. So it should include the biological areas, developmental areas, social areas. It should include all the areas that were in the course, right? I've taken many classes where the test was only on a couple parts of the class, right? Didn't cover the whole class, which means that that test really isn't measuring my knowledge of the whole class, right? Those could have been the only areas that I got, or those could have been the only areas that I didn't get, right? And so when you're making a test, you want to ensure that you're getting all the areas that were in the course on the test, right? That's one of the ways that we learn about instruction from research methods. Another thing is with reliability. So validity has to do with measuring the thing that we're trying to measure. Reliability has to do with the consistency of the measure. If we did it again, we'd get a similar sort of result. One of the things that we know about reliability is that it's enhanced by asking the same thing more than one way, right? Rather than just ask one question about one topic, we're going to have better reliability if we ask multiple questions about that same topic. And that kind of makes sense, because if you only ask one question, it could be a bad question for whatever reason, right? Maybe it's the only question you ask about a topic, and it was a really easy question, so everyone gets it right, regardless of how much they knew about the topic, right? Or maybe it was a really difficult question, everyone gets it wrong, regardless of how much they knew about the topic, okay? So it could have been a bad question. Asking the question multiple ways is going to increase the likelihood of measuring their actual learning, right? Their actual knowledge. And so in general, for reliability, more questions is better. So I know some people would rather take a really short test, but if you take a really short test, then the issue is that it's not going to do a very good job measuring your actual ability. There's too much chance it's going to play a role. There's too much maybe the one question about that topic was just a bad question. There is, of course, going to eventually be fatigue and things like that. So eventually, too many questions is going to become a bad thing. But it's actually a better indicator of your actual ability if the test is longer rather than shorter. Okay, so now some of the things that we've learned about memory that are important and useful for learning about instruction. So the first thing is about the organization of information. So we're going to learn information more easily if it's organized, right? So what I mean by that is, let's say that you have to remember a bunch of terms that are fruit terms, and you also have to remember a bunch of vegetable terms, right? It would be easier for us to learn it, and we would be faster learning it if they're organized where maybe we have all the vegetables grouped together and we have all the fruits grouped together, right? Rather than having them mixed together. And I'll actually come back to this in a little bit. Because it's faster to learn this way, but there's maybe some benefits to learning it a different way as well. Another thing that we know about memory that's useful for instruction is an effect that's called distinctiveness of trace. So the idea with distinctiveness of trace is we are better able to recall information that is unique or unusual in some way. Okay? So if you are studying a list of terms, and there's one term that you really want to make absolutely sure that you remember it, well, you could put it in red, or you could highlight it. And that will make it stand out from the other items, which will then increase the chances that you'll be able to remember it later. I do want to point out, if you put every word in red, or if you put every word highlighted, then this effect will completely disappear, right? Because it's the fact that it's unique that's a benefit, right? And this also works where if you have a guest speaker, right? You're actually more likely to remember things that they said because it was a different person saying it, right? So you're getting the information from an unusual way, which is going to help. Elaboration and imagery are also going to be helpful for memory. So these are, the elaboration especially is a little counterintuitive, right? So if you're trying to remember a word, what you might actually do is come up with a word for each letter in that word, right? Seems counterintuitive because you're now having to remember more things, but it turns out having a word associated with each letter in the word is giving you more cues that can help you retrieve that information later. And so actually adding information onto something that we're trying to remember is something that's actually going to help us remember it. Yeah, there is kind of more of a burden in that there's more that we're having to remember, but it's more likely that we'll remember that thing that we're trying to remember. Imagery works in kind of the same way, right? That's a form of elaboration. So you can imagine something visual that goes with what you're trying to remember. And that incorporating an additional sense, right, incorporating vision, is going to help us remember it even better than just incorporating more words or things like that. There's also this effect of deeper processing. So it turns out how we process the information is going to have an effect on how well we learn and remember it. If you focus on very physical aspects of the words, right? So you're trying to learn a word or you're trying to learn information, and you're focused on very physical aspects of it, like whether or not the word was capitalized, what color the word was written in, things like that. That's going to lead to very shallow processing, not very deep processing. You're not going to remember that information very well. If you think about a word that rhymes with it, or if you think about something that has to do with the sound of the word, that's going to be a little bit better. But what's going to be the best is if you focus on the meaning of the word. Okay? So if you're focused on, if you're coming up with a synonym for that word, or if you are determining whether or not you like that word, right? Is that a word that's good or bad, right? Attaching that kind of meaning to the word, attaching that kind of information to the word is going to result in deeper processing, which means that you're going to be better able to remember that information. Okay? And it doesn't have to be a word. It could be a complete information. Okay? A lot of the studies are done with individual words and remembering of individual words, but this applies way beyond that, right? It turns out if you connect the material to yourself, it works even better than just focusing on the meaning, right? So you shouldn't just be thinking about, what is the meaning of this word, what is the significance of the word. You should be thinking, how is this significant for me, right? How is this related to me? And that's going to improve your memory even more. The idea with encoding specificity is that the more similar the retrieval environment is to the original environment, the better chance of retrieving that information. So I'm kind of throwing around a couple words that I'm not really going to explain much. But the idea is that if you are learning about something in one particular room, you're going to perform better if you're also tested in that particular room, right? So if you're doing all your studying at home and then you're tested in the classroom, that's not going to be as effective as if you're actually studying in that room, right? Transfer appropriate processing is kind of the same idea, but from the opposite end, right? If you know how you're going to have to use the information, you actually store it kind of differently, okay? So if you know that you're going to be taking a multiple choice test versus if you know that you're going to be taking a written test, you're going to study differently, right? You're going to commit that information to memory in a different way. And so you'll perform better if it's a match to how you studied, right? And so if you were preparing for a multiple choice test and it turns out you actually have an essay test, it's not going to be as good, okay? Breaks and spaced practice are also very helpful for learning, right? So it is better to, instead of study in a 2-hour block, to spread that out in maybe half-hour blocks, right? That's going to be much, much better for your learning. This is also sort of indicating that it's important to study multiple times, right? Not just all at once. It's important to break up that studying, do it multiple times, do less at a time, but more times is going to be more effective than doing it all at once. You're also going to do better if you test yourself. So the alternative here is that they compare people who get extra time studying to people who get a practice test, right? People who are testing themselves actually do a lot better than people who get that extra time studying, okay? And there's multiple explanations for why that might be happening. One of the reasons why that might be happening is because you're getting that practice retrieving the information. And so then you can retrieve it later more easily because it's something that you've practiced. I also want to talk about cognitive load. The idea with cognitive load is that we have a limit to how much we can process, right? There's a limit. We can't process everything that comes into us. And if what we're trying to learn requires more capacity than what we have, we're not going to be successful at learning, okay? So a lot of the ideas with cognitive load are really about reducing the demand, right? So getting the amount that's required down so that we can learn it effectively, okay? So research on cognitive load shows us that you do better on worked examples and partially completed problems than you do starting the problem from scratch, right? So if you're doing a math problem, it's actually going to be more effective for your learning if there's like steps that are missing that you have to fill out rather than having to do the problem from start to finish, okay? And there's going to be a big but to this. There's something called the split attention effect, right? So we're going to have an easier time understanding material if we don't have to go to legends or glossaries in order to figure out what the information is telling us. Okay, so that's why a lot of textbooks have, I hope that's why, a lot of textbooks have now moved to sort of having the definition sort of in the margins rather than you having to flip to the glossary to find the definition. The alternative to using a legend would be to label it directly, right? So that's an alternative. Redundancy effect, it turns out it's better if we present something in only one way, okay? So presenting things in multiple ways, it's using more of our capacity, right? And so then we don't have as much capacity to go around if we're having to use it to learn the same thing 2 different ways, okay? So it's better to reduce the redundancy, right? Teach it one way. Modality effect, we can do better if we incorporate more than one modality. So if we can incorporate something that's visual and something that's auditory, that's going to be better for our learning than if we're relying all of the information to come through hearing or all of the information to come through in a visual way, okay? And coupled with the redundancy effect, it's better actually if they're different information, okay? And so one of the places where we can see the modality effect is actually if we're looking at something that's written, it's easier for us to answer orally, right? If we're hearing something, it's easier for us to answer written. Okay? Isolated interacting elements. So this is kind of the idea when you have a bunch of parts that are working together, it's better to learn each of the parts separately first before sort of grouping them together. And so understanding the parts first before you get the whole. There's a goal-free effect. So the idea here is that the goal that you are supposed to be accomplishing actually takes up some of the capacity. So if you're given very specific instructions for what you have to do, you're going to have to remember those instructions and then also use what's left of your capacity to do the task. Okay? So it's actually easier if the goal is more vague, right? So rather than, an example might be, rather than solve for something in particular, it's just solve as much as you can, right? So if we're thinking in a math class, solve for as many of the variables as you can, rather than solve for these ones specifically. Because if we're having to solve for these specific ones, we have to keep those specific ones in our memory while also trying to solve them, okay? And so the goal-free effect is that it's better if the goals are vague and that you don't have to remember a lot, because that takes up some of your capacity. We are going to do better if our learning environment is more variable, okay? I guess I don't want to say a lot more about that. But just the idea is like if you're only learning it in the very same way every time, it's not going to be as effective for your learning as if there's more variability in your learning. Now we're getting to some of the but that I mentioned earlier, okay? So it actually turns out that a lot of these effects, right, they're all aimed at reducing the demand of the task, right? They're all aimed at getting the task down to where you can complete it with the amount of resources that you have. Well, it turns out that if it is well below your limit, then you're not using all the resources that you have and you could actually be learning more, okay? And so the idea is, although you never want to go above your limits, it's ideal if you don't go far below it, right? So you can sort of pack in more learning the closer you are to your limit without going over kind of idea, okay? And so the imagination effect is actually, it turns out that it's effective to, rather than going back to the information, actually try and generate the information for yourself, okay? That's going to be more effective. Also turns out there's this guidance fading effect. So as you become more and more experienced, more and more practice in that area, have greater and greater knowledge in that area, a lot of these things that we were doing before are now less useful, right? So it used to be useful to give worked examples, but then, to give worked examples to study, right? So you can see what the problem looks like from start to finish. Then we're going to maybe want to do part of the problem is done and they just have to finish it. Then you're actually going to want to do the whole problem from start to finish, right? And so it's kind of this idea of the amount of guidance that's needed is going to become reduced. And there's also this expertise reversal effect where a lot of these things that were once useful because they were reducing the demand of the task, now you actually want to do the exact opposite, right? You want to increase the demand of the task to get as much learning out of the person as possible. Okay, and the Sweller 1998 has a really good summary of a lot of this information. What has research on reading taught us about instruction? Okay, so it turns out having prior knowledge is very important. Okay, so that kind of makes sense, right? If we're trying to have someone understand a very complicated topic, it's better if they understand a little bit about the topic first. That sort of foundation is going to help them understand what they're reading much better. Easier for us to follow the information if we can make causal connections, right? So if I just tell you someone is going to the store to buy flour and eggs and chocolate chips, it's not as easy to understand or to remember what's happening as if I tell you they're trying to make chocolate chip cookies, and then you can now see the things that they're buying as causally related to their goal, right? So they're trying to make cookies, and so they're buying things that are needed to make cookies, right? So making that causal connection is going to be helpful for understanding. Perspective. So changing your perspective is actually going to be very helpful for your understanding of material. So a classic study that was done in this area is they have people read a description of a house first as a homeowner, and then they read the same description as a house as a burglar, right? And so they're sort of changing the perspective that they're using while they're reading it. And by doing that, they remember things that they didn't even notice the previous read, right? Because the things that are important to a homeowner and the things that are important to a burglar are not the same things, right? And so by having that change in perspective, you're able to get more information out. So if you're thinking about this from the side of being a student, right? Maybe first read it from a person who's trying to inform themselves about the topic, and then maybe go back through and read it again from the perspective of someone who wants to test people on that topic, right? So that going from the student to instructor sort of point of view will maybe allow you to pick up on different parts of the information than you previously picked up on. Frequency of words. So it turns out we have an easier time understanding if the words that are used are more common or the words that we expect, okay? So that's not terribly surprising, but it's true. Ambiguity is something that is going to have a big effect on our reading ability. So by ambiguity, I mean that the sentence is unclear, okay? So we are given a statement and it's unclear exactly what's being said. So one of the classic examples of the ambiguity is where they describe a government building that has bugs in it, okay? And the ambiguity there is that you don't know if these are insect bugs or if these are listening device bugs, right? Because it's in a government building, so they kind of both make sense. The idea is that that ambiguity is going to cause us a lot of problems understanding, because this is going to tie back into cognitive load like I was talking about before. We have this limited capacity, right? And we can't go beyond that capacity. And so if we're having to remember that sentence, right, and figure out what was it meant insects or was it meant listening devices, right? We're going to have to sort of carry that sentence with us forward and sort of keep both possibilities in mind up until it gets clarified, okay? And so it turns out the more information that gets added in, the harder this is going to be up until the ambiguity gets cleared up, right? So up until we finally get to that point where, oh, they meant insects, or oh, they meant listening devices, this is going to interfere with our ability to understand everything that we're reading, okay? Because we're going to be sort of carrying that with us, trying to remember or figure out which meaning was meant. Having to make fewer inferences, right? So by inferences, I mean we're having to figure out information from without it being explicitly stated. So fewer inferences is going to increase our comprehension of reading. Fewer reinstatement searches. By reinstatement searches, I mean us having to go back to previous material, okay? And so that's why it's always good to sort of summarize the relevant stuff right before it's used again. That's gonna be helpful, because that's gonna prevent us from having to do those reinstatement searches, right? Prevent us from having to go back to like what happened 3 chapters back, kind of a situation. Okay? And then we're also going to have better comprehension if we have an expected structure, right? So if everything's following the same structure and we can start to learn and predict that structure, that's going to assist in our comprehension of the information. As far as experience and expertise, I think this is kind of interesting. I don't have as many specific things that are going to be helpful as on some of the other topics, but I think that this is really interesting. There's kind of this idea that experts are going to be better at everything, right? That's kind of a prediction that you might have. It turns out they don't, right? They're not better at everything. They're better at specific things, and there's actually some things where they're going to be worse, okay? So experts have improved memory and problem-solving abilities in that domain, okay? Chess masters can recreate entire chessboards, but they can only do this for meaningful configurations. So if we have chess pieces on a board and they're arranged in a way that could actually happen during a chess game, chess masters are way better than novices at recreating what the chessboard looks like, right? They can do things well beyond what our normal memory limitations tell us. However, if the chess pieces are in a manner that is not possible during an actual chess game, they don't have any better memory, and they're not any better able to put those pieces back on the board where they were than a novice is, okay? So they're able to recreate the entire chessboard that they've seen only if it's a meaningful configuration. If it's not a meaningful configuration, they don't have any advantage over novices anymore. Firefighters can predict natural fires. They're unable to predict what would happen with man-made fires. Does a fire know if it's man-made or natural? I would guess no. So it turns out man-made and natural fires actually behave exactly the same way, right? But firefighters are only able to predict what natural fires will do. They don't apply that information to man-made fires because they don't realize that it's the same problem, right? They're not applying all their expertise to that problem. So in general, experts actually show less transfer than novices, right? Someone just learning a topic is likely to apply it very broadly. Someone who knows that topic well, they're less likely to apply it to other areas, right? So it's like they've kind of determined these are the areas that it applies to, and they don't apply it beyond those areas anymore. Whereas novices, they're going to apply it to everything. Okay? Experts also tend to be worse at low-frequency problems. Okay? So both identifying and solving. So it's actually the case that a fresh out of med school doctor would be better than an experienced doctor at these really rare things, right? So the things that the doctor's not going to be experiencing during their time as a doctor, the person fresh out of med school is going to be much better at, right? And they're also going to be, the experienced doctor is also going to be less likely to recognize this rare thing because their experience tells them it doesn't happen often, okay? They're also better at not over-diagnosing rare illnesses too, though, right? So on the flip side, we see the fresh out of med school is going to be thinking these illnesses that are actually very rare are more common than they are. Okay, so they're going to maybe, the experienced doctor is going to maybe underdiagnose rare things, but the med school, right out of med school, is going to overdiagnose those same things. As far as the implications, this one's a little muddier. I guess you could train firefighters on man-made fires. It seems like there's maybe another dimension to this that we need to work out. Maybe the mix is actually good, right? Because I'm thinking with the doctors, we have this one group that overdiagnose and this one group that underdiagnose. So I'm thinking maybe there's a way we could actually use both of those extremes to our advantage rather than maybe make the expert doctors more practiced on those things because then they're going to lead to overdiagnosing again, right? So I'm thinking overtraining is important educationally, right? So in med school, we really want the doctors to get trained on those rare things, right? Because they're not going to see them in real life much, right? So we really need to make sure that we do the job training them in advance. An option is we could maybe maintain the training on rare procedures for doctors, right? So keep up that training so that they don't lose that diagnosing it or that solving those problems kinds of things. But then they may be making that other error where they're going to now overdiagnose. So this is kind of a joke, but kind of serious. Maybe get diagnosed by both, right? Maybe get the new doctor and the old doctor to both diagnose you. Because then maybe we can sort of benefit from the fact that they're kind of at different extremes. Okay, as far as category learning, turns out there's two big areas of category learning, or there's two big types of category structures that look very different from a learning perspective. So we have rule-based things. By rule-based, I mean you can come up with a rule that tells you which is a member of which category. So the idea of category learning is just that we're trying to learn something where we're not learning each individual thing, we're learning categories. And so everything belongs to one of two or more categories, okay? And so there's multiple items that would apply to each category. If that category can be described with a rule, right? So all of the big things are in category A, all of the small things are in category B, right? Or all of the dark things are in category A, all the light things are in category B, right? If we can come up with a rule like that that can describe all of them, then you can learn it suddenly, which isn't surprising, right? As soon as you figure out what the rule is, then you can now achieve perfect performance, right? So there's sudden learning. Working memory correlates, right? So again, that's that capacity that we have. We need that capacity in order to learn rules. Okay, so we have to have that capacity available to us to learn rules. Switching responses is easily learned. So let's say I have categories A and B. Well, now I'm going to flip them. That's actually not a problem. So you can pretty easily learn, okay, B is now A and A is now B, and that's not really a problem. The idea is with rule-based things, you just need it explained the right way, and then you've got it. Okay? And so I'm thinking instructionally and educationally, there's a lot of things like this, right? As soon as it's explained the right way, that's done, right? It's over, you've got it, and that's the end of the story. There are other things, though. Not everything is like that. Similarity-based categories. So these are where all of the members of a category share some similarity, but that similarity can't necessarily be described in a rule. Okay? So they are all similar, but there isn't necessarily a rule that can describe what that similarity is. Okay? With similarity-based structures, we learn them gradually. There isn't that you've suddenly got it kind of thing. Performance is going to gradually improve as you better understand those categories, but there's not going to be this sudden improvement like there would be with a rule. Working memory is less involved, right? This is something where actually similarity-based category structures we can actually learn without even trying. Okay, we don't have to try to learn them. We can just learn them through exposure, and then we've got them. Switching responses is extremely difficult. Okay, so if I tell you A is now B and B is now A, you're kind of going back to when you first started learning them. Okay, because that really undoes all the learning that you had. With the similarity based, it's the practice, right? It's not, it just needs explained the right way. It's you just need the practice. So you just need to keep doing it, getting that exposure, getting that familiarity, and then eventually you'll get it. Okay? But notice that these are achieved in very different ways, right? So the one is like once it's explained the right way, you got it and it's done. This one is you have to keep practicing and then eventually you'll get it. And so they are different. It turns out with experience, things tend to shift more towards looking like this similarity-based kind of thing. So what initially might have looked rule-based, over time starts to look more similarity-based. It stops requiring your working memory. It starts to be influenced by this switching of the category labels, whereas initially it wasn't. Right? Initially it wasn't sensitive to those things. I want to talk a little bit about some work that I did in category learning. Okay? So the idea here is you wanted to learn something, and I wanted to know what is the best way to spend your time in order to learn it. Okay? So some options is you could learn something easier first, right? So kind of step up the difficulty. Another option is you could learn something harder first, right? So you could get exposed to something that was actually more difficult, and then hopefully some of that information will translate to what you're trying to learn. Another option is you could just spend all of your time trying to learn the task that you're trying to learn. Okay, so those are the three options that I want to talk about. Okay, so some of the benefits or support for the low difficulty training being beneficial is that sort of the traditional route, right? Kind of stepping up difficulties, kind of a traditional thing that's done. You may be gaining prerequisite skills, right? So by doing the easier thing, you may get skills that are then useful in the next step. This is how shaping works in behaviorism, right? So you're going to gradually move their behavior to what you want it to be, right? It's that kind of gradual idea again. How we naturally learn. So our reaching and our language, they kind of move up in steps, kind of like this. This is also how we choose to learn. And so I think that this is kind of interesting, that when people are given a choice of problems and they're told the difficulty levels, they tend to start with easy problems and then move up towards more difficult problems. And so you might suspect that they might just stick with easy problems all the time. That doesn't happen. You might expect that they might start at more difficult problems. That usually doesn't happen either, right? They tend to start with easy stuff, sort of gauge, and then move up, right? Take on more and more challenge, okay? So it's how we naturally learn, how we choose to learn, and then there's some other reasons why we might think that low difficulty training would be beneficial. Some of the support for high difficulty training. It turns out intermixed practice is useful for your learning. And so by intermixed practice, so this was people were learning French, and rather than have all French to English or all English to French, they had to do both. And so if they saw a French word, they had to come up with the English word. If they were shown an English word, they had to come up with the French word, okay? And so they didn't know which kind of word they were going to get, versus the other groups were given all French to English or all English to French. They were given both kind of mixed together, and they actually learned the French words better. Okay? Generating examples is also helpful, right? And so this is something that's more effortful on your part if you have to come up with the example, but then you're also more likely to learn it, more likely to remember it. Having an inconsistent structure is also better. And so imagine you have something that's given to you chronologically, right? So it's in order that it happened. Well, then you're asked questions based on the topic, right? So not on the order in which it happened, but based on similar topics, okay? So this structure is inconsistent with how you learned the information. Well, it turns out by having that inconsistent structure, you're actually going to learn the information better, okay? So people were able to answer harder questions about the material that they read when the outline was inconsistent with the structure of what they read. If you notice, the organization principle was saying it's easier to learn if it's sort of consistent, right? So we kind of have that structure, it's easier to learn, but now this is showing there's also benefits to not being consistent. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. More inclusive math problems are more useful. So the idea was that they were given an easier or a more difficult math problem, and they could use the more difficult math problem to help them solve a moderate difficulty math problem. They couldn't really use the easier math problem to help them solve this moderate difficulty math problem. And so these are all some evidence that maybe it's better to have the high difficulty. Okay. Continued practice, you've got more time learning the task that you're trying to learn, right? That should be a benefit. There's also going to be a similarity of training in the test, which should boost performance, right? Because you're being trained and tested kind of on the same thing, right? So there's a good match between what you're doing and what you're trying to ultimately do. Okay? So how this worked is participants viewed 1, 2, or 3-dimensional dot patterns. In a lot of my work, we tend to use kind of simple stimuli. The reason is because it helps get rid of a lot of the complexity that would otherwise be there, right? A lot of the alternative explanations for the results that we get, previous learning, previous experiences, right? So we tend to use kind of simplistic stimuli. They either saw a 1, 2, or 3-dimensional dot pattern, and whether it was a member of category A or a member of category B depends upon how many dots there were, basically. And so you might see a dot pattern that looks like that. The 2-dimensional, there's 2 dot patterns. 3-dimensional, there's 3, okay? And dimensionality, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 dimensions, is a strong predictor of how difficult it is, okay? So it's a lot easier to do this 1-dimensional task where you're deciding if it's in category A or B than when you're having to rely on 2 or 3 dimensions, okay? And so this is how the task looked. So this is what the 2-dimensional task might look like. So you see this stimuli, and you're supposed to determine whether it's A or B. And at first, you have no idea what A or B is, so you just have to guess, right? And so let's say I think that this is A. It tells me that I'm correct, and then I move on to the next trial. I think this one's also A. It tells me that I'm incorrect, right? And so through that experience, you'll gradually learn the distinction between the A and B category. Okay? And so some people went from a 1-dimensional task to a 2-dimensional task, and I have 2 different 2-dimensional tasks, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's a low difficulty, right? They're going from something easier to something harder. They're stepping up in terms of the difficulty. Another group went from the 3-dimensional task to a 2-dimensional task. That's the high difficulty, right? So they started with something harder than what they're eventually going to have to learn. Then we have a group, and I'm actually not going to talk much about this group because they're just got problems. But this is the moderate difficulty group. So they went from one of the 2-dimensional tasks to the other 2-dimensional task. Okay? There's some confusion and things like that that make this just not a very good group. Okay? And then there's a continued practice where they spent both days, right? So this is a 2-day study where you learn one of these 4 things on the first day, and you learn one of these 2 things on the second day. Okay? And so the idea was everyone on the second day is trying to learn a similar thing. Okay? And the continuing practice, they spent both of their days learning that one task. Okay, this is some information about the category structures, not super important, but this is kind of the idea is category A had a mean of 247 dots, category B had a mean of 153 dots, so it's like the ones that had 247, that's the mean for B, but there are members, or mean for A, but there's members that have fewer and members that have more than that, okay? And so then this is the variance, so it's 40 squared, so that means that 68% of members of category A are going to be within 40 dots above 247 and 40 dots below 247. Again, it's not super important for understanding. This is just to give you a little bit of an idea of what was going on. I also want to point out that there's overlap between the categories. And so actually the optimal percent that you should be able to get correct is not 100%. The optimal amount that you should be able to get correct is 88%. If you get any more than 88% correct, then that's partly just due to you got lucky. Okay? But that's because of the overlap between categories A and B. That's sort of what we should expect if you really got the learning. Okay? All right. So my first hypothesis was that continued practice was going to result in the best performance on the target task, right? So getting a whole extra day of learning that same task, that's got to be the biggest benefit. Hypothesis 2, I kind of could have gone either way. There was a lot of evidence for why stepping up difficulty would be helpful. There was also evidence for why stepping down difficulty might be helpful. And I came to the prediction that I thought that the more difficult task was going to be the better thing to learn first. That was my prediction. I was completely wrong. Okay, so this is what performance looked like on task A. I actually want to focus more on task B. They look very similar, but task B shows the points that I want to make a little bit better. So that red line is the continued practice line. So the first thing you should notice is it's not the highest up line, right? So on the y-axis here, we have the performance. Well, I was expecting the red line to be certainly at the beginning the highest up. On this x-axis, we have the trials, right? So this is over time in the experiment. For sure, I thought the red line should have started the highest. It did not. Also kind of thought it might end the highest. It did not, right? Continued practice line is actually pretty close to completely flat. They did not show significant improvement the second day. So it's kind of like their second day learning this task was kind of a waste. That blue line is the people who had the easier task first. Right as soon as they got to this new task, they're already doing better than these people who spent an entire previous day learning it. So that's really kind of surprising and really kind of interesting. You'll notice that they also have a steeper slope, right? So they're learning more than the continued practice group ever did. The green line starts below. That's completely expected, right? It should have started below the continued practice, but it actually has the steepest slope, right? They're actually improving the most now that they're doing this new task. Okay? And again, you don't really have to pay attention to that yellow line because there were problems with that. That's not a big deal that it's the worst. It looks terrible. There's a lot of explanations for why that might be. But what's very interesting is that red line being flat and then those blue and green lines. Those are pretty interesting. Okay? So continued practice didn't show significant improvement the second day, right? It was kind of a waste, right? They really didn't gain any benefit from that additional day. Low and high difficulty are kind of both better than the continued practice, which that was kind of a surprise. There was some evidence for both of them being good, right? But they kind of were both better than continued practice, and this really surprised me. Kind of my takeaway from this and what my current thought from additional things that I've read and additional things that I've done is that I kind of think that change is beneficial, right? So you don't want to just spend all of your time doing one thing. It's actually having the change could be beneficial. And then maybe even just superficial changes, right? Just something to make it different can lead to improvement. So something that often happens is sometimes students will do poorly on a test and they'll say, I spent all this time studying, but how they studied was they just read the book over and over again, right? This is saying that's probably not an effective way to study, right? It's probably more effective if you mix up how you're doing your studying, right? And so it'd be much better if they read it, then maybe make an outline of it without even looking at it, then test themselves on it, make flashcards, do all kinds of different things. And it's not completely clear from this data if the stepping up or the stepping down is the better choice, but they both look better than the continued practice. Okay, so what did we learn? I'll open this up to you guys in a second, but I wanted to have a couple cautions before we go that direction. Better isn't always better, right? So I talked about the inconsistent structure being slower to learn. but it might lead to better understanding and longer retention, right? So we talked about the organization being helpful for getting it into your memory, right? But that inconsistent structure might lead to better understanding and longer retention than the organized information did. Okay, so there's kind of some cost-benefit kind of thing happening here. More experience isn't universally better, right? I think that's really interesting. Leads to worse transfer, right? Worse at low-frequency problems, right? I found that very interesting and kind of surprising, right? We kind of think experts are going to be better universally. Turns out to not be true, okay? Also turns out what's good in your early training might not be good later in your training, okay? So when you're first learning something, I'm especially thinking of the cognitive load stuff, when you're first learning something, you need to get the requirement down as low as possible, right? But then once you've got it a bit, you actually want to raise up the challenge, right? You actually want to make it more challenging because that's the way that you're going to get more learning out of it. Okay? And so there's one slide left, but it's a thank you slide. So I'll leave that one. No, I guess I should thank people now in case some people want to leave. So I will thank you guys for coming and applauding. And now I would open it up to questions. And I'm also kind of curious what you guys learned or what you guys got out of it. Yeah.
First of all, thank you. There's so much in your talk that I have about 10 questions. So I'll try to first one that I came up with. And I hope it's clear because there are a few things that I'm mixing together. But I hope I got the first question right because I teach logic.
Okay. You may have.
So, and in particular, I want to teach students how to think about conditionals and how to test them. And there are a couple of theories. So you're making a point about concreteness that's taken no matter what I have to say about this. I'm not sort of questioning the importance of concrete examples. But I want students to see how they will get this problem wrong. And I think that they get it wrong not just because I give them an abstract question, but because it's a familiar case where they are likely to test for something disconfirming evidence. So there's two things going on here. Is one, familiarity, and another, our tendency to look for confirmation rather than to test our rules. And so I give them this example that I know they'll get wrong because that's a concrete example of them not testing but looking for a confirmation. And so I use that particular concrete one. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask about, I teach that in particular, is when should we exploit the kinds of things that our brains are likely to do on the basis of experience. There are certain tasks we're good at. So I can see a 5-year-old who knows how to think logically about A or B. A, not A, therefore B. Like I see them use this kind of reasoning as a 5-year-old, but then I ask an educated college student to do this on an exam and they get it wrong. I'm like, I know you know this reasoning in a really familiar case where you would actually need to reason this way. And there are certain times where we can not make a task any more difficult than it needs to be, right, by understanding all these ways that the brain works. But then there are other cases where if you rely on stuff you know about memory or whatever, you might just be allowing them to exploit the things you want to challenge. Like, there are all kinds of things students can do, like I could give them on exams so that they will do better, but it's challenging those things is the only way they can actually learn the material. I want them to have transfer beyond the concrete familiar cases where their brains are likely to lead them in the right direction to the general rule where you really have to know how to challenge the way the brain is naturally going to help them out here. So do you have any advice or particular, like how to think about when are you exploiting the brain for?
So I'm like, I do like the idea of kind of, it's like teaching them a lesson and giving them a concrete example by sort of using it to make them make mistakes. I like that being done early on, like in instruction before, rather than like for a test. I'm like, I really like that. And then I also like the idea of that kind of like, some of what you're seeing might be kind of like that experts are actually worse in some areas kinds of things, because it's like they're relying on their knowledge in other areas, or they're failing to use their knowledge from other areas to apply. I'm not exactly sure. So you're trying to say when we should use this to make them do better, and when we should use it to make them do worse? Is that kind of the...
Use it to make them to do worse, but the specific point of whatever it is you're trying to teach has to challenge the way they're naturally going to think about it.
I think I like the idea of first make it as accessible as possible, then challenge it. I like that. There are cases where you might actually want to start off challenging it because you want them to really see how this is a problem. But I kind of like the idea of first do it to make sure that they get it, because sometimes it's like if they get it wrong, they may not even be understanding why they get it wrong, right? Because like if I explain that problem just in the abstract way, even after telling someone that they're wrong, they're not going to understand how it's wrong until I tell them in the concrete way, so they can now understand that. Is that making sense? Is that addressing your question, kind of? My perspective is that make it accessible first to make sure that they've got it, and then challenge them as high a bar as you want, because that's actually going to lift them higher than what they get in real life, right? Because like I kind of like that idea of over learning, right? I like that we prepare them better than what they'll get in real life, because we aren't really motivated to get perfect in real life, right? We're motivated to get good enough, and so we make what's good enough as high as possible, then they'll achieve more and then be better prepared afterwards. But I guess mine would be easy first, then the challenge from that, because like make sure that they're understanding it well enough that you can really challenge them. But I do for sure think that challenging step is important. And I hope I answered your question. I feel like, 70%. Okay, I saw, and you'll be next, yeah.
I have a question with a couple of statements that preceded. Maybe teaching and learning aren't absolute, or it depends on what people's motivations are. So let me say this, that psychologists have to understand advertising. They have to know something about advertising. And people in advertising have to know a lot about psychology.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the slides you put up before you were talking about experts was reducing ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
Let me suggest that some people would use ambiguity on purpose to teach, hoping that they can get people to learn what they want to sell. So let's say a man bought his wife a bottle of perfume called Eros. And he might be expressing affection and whatever, but the bottle, is it the bottle or is it the affection that's being played upon in the marketing of that product?
Mm-hmm.
The psychologist might have a very different response to it from the ad person. They're both teaching, they're learning, and one person is promoting ambiguity, the other person's got to say, you got to get that beyond the ambiguity to understand what's happening to you. You're being taken because that bottle is everything it's supposed to be.
I for sure agree with you, and that's an important point. This stuff can be used for evil, if that's kind of. So I was kind of kidding in that, but I'm like, I think it's a really good point, because these can be used in both directions, right? This kind of knowledge can be used in both directions and for different purposes. And for sure, you can achieve different goals through different things.
And even the advertising part in public health or safety or whatever could be very, much towards the civic ends.
Right. I'm thinking of it as how we could use it as learners or as instructors in an academic setting. That's kind of how this was tailored.
Yeah.
But it's 100% true. This can be used in lots of other ways.
There may be some linkage to what she was asking about there in terms of logic.
Yeah.
How we challenge people to think things through a little bit. And I don't know. I'm not quite sure
I
what it
think
is.
partly critical thinking
Yeah.
is that when they're not critically thinking, they're just accepting blindly. And you want depth of processing so that they are evaluating the information. If it's ambiguous, it could be interpreted so that you can take different perspectives. And so in our discipline, then there's a huge component of being aware of other perspectives so that you can understand, the behaviors or the mental processes.
I guess the advertisers might play with the subconscious more than the academic would.
And actually, kind of like overloading your capacity, it has benefits if you don't want them to think about things too much and things like that too. Like lots of it can be used in multiple ways. It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a middle ground too to that though, because say if the bottle of perfume was shaped in an unsightly manner, like as a baby diaper per se, would that still be affectionate, or would that be kind of a prank? Or I guess because he was saying it's like is it the affection that makes it a gift, or that physical object? So I think there's a little bit of a middle ground there. But my question is with the hard
Sounds like a great art exhibit.
with the hard difficulty method of training, you said inconsistent structure is good. Is that because they come to depend on the flexibility of mind and knowledge of the material versus like lighting in the room?
So part of the reason why the inconsistent structure might have been helpful is because if you are so part of how this worked is you read a passage and then you have an outline, and so it's like you're kind of filling out the outline from the passage, and the outline is set up just like the passage. Doesn't take very much work to kind of line them up, to kind of just transfer this information over. You don't really have to think that deeply on it. You can kind of do it pretty easily. Whereas if it's an inconsistent structure, you're having to really search for the information, having to get more experience with it. It is a little more challenging, and then pull the pieces to where they actually belong.
I get it. So it's like it's not necessarily the subject matter, but it's teaching your brain to almost think in a way, like you said, pulling it from all the different.
Yeah, this is a lot more effortful, right? And so the consistent structure is actually easier to learn initially. But then this inconsistent structure led to better understanding of the material because you could answer harder questions.
And then one more thing. Like when I saw the movie Interstellar, like my mind, you've heard of that movie?
I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's like a bunch of things in space, different dimensions. My mind was spinning for like 3 days. Do you think that was because of overload, like you were talking about? Because that just went beyond my comprehension.
Yeah, no, that's right. Because it's like it was kind of beyond. Yeah, I could see that as kind of beyond your limit.
Okay.
Or you were smoking the day before.
But you know what? That's kind of interesting though, because if you're able to sort of like keep pieces and keep working on them, you can sort of get some of the ideas out later.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I'm wondering how well established this idea of cognitive overload is, because my students will sometimes wail and gnash teeth if I say, you're going to be tested on 6 weeks of material, and they're like, oh, 6 weeks of material, I can't possibly do that. And then I'll remind them that student pilots have to remember necessarily an incredible amount of information in order to pass an FAA test to fly. Lawyers have to take a bar exam, and it's not 6 weeks of material, it's 3 years of material, plus all the things you didn't learn in law school besides. And yet they have this feeling that I'm overloaded.
Right. Well, the cognitive load really is pertaining to sort of a very limited amount of time, right? Because it's like you do have this capacity, but the more familiarity you gain with something, the less capacity it takes up, right? So it's like this is when you're first learning it that these limitations are a problem. But it's like once they learn it, that stuff takes up like no capacity eventually. Is this making sense? So it's like if they're studying with that material for the whole 6 weeks, right, then it won't actually demand very much of them anymore.
And that's why you want more complexity in time, because you're getting into it more deeply, right?
Right. So it's like the initial learning is where this limit is coming up. If they're working on it little by little and they're getting that mastered, then it doesn't seem like very much.
20 minutes of focusing on something as opposed to 3 hours would only, to me, I think, seem applicable at the very beginning, because later on, one would want to have that 3 hours to sit down and reflect and begin to work out some ways of interpreting and acting on that. And if you had to stop every 20 minutes and whenever you never get past sort of orienting yourself to take the next step.
And that's for sure true. The idea that like the amount of time that's optimal is going to gradually increase,
Yes.
right? Because like I don't know that it'll get to 3 hours very quickly, but it's like that. It seems like a long time when we're just learning it. Even that 30 minutes seems
I
like a long
love
time.
3 hours. To sit down.
You know that stuff very well. But it's like it will stretch,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because one thing is the sort of the formal learning, the method, and I'm thinking the material that we in philosophy that we present to the students is an enormous learning curve. From all depending on if it's the first philosophy class or the seventh or so. I mean, it makes a big difference. And most of us do not. I mean, some of us I know, especially people who've gone through the educational system at a later time than I have undergone certain psychological training methods in terms of teaching. So some of this terminology will be familiar, and it's not familiar to me. But in a formal sense, I think a lot of us, we actually do use a lot of the methods that you're showing, just because it works. Over the years, we modify our methods so that it works better. So that would be the formality of it. But I'm thinking in terms of a method that is tried and true in philosophy, but among colleagues more so than introducing the material to students, is the adversarial method. That is what we use. We take a venerable view and then viewpoint, and we tear it apart. And then we move on to the next one, and we tear it apart. And that is a semester in philosophy. we look at these famous viewpoints, we tear them apart. And I know, and it's becoming increasingly clear to me how disturbing that is to a lot of freshman students. You learn something that's fascinating, and then what do you do with it? You learn how to tear it apart. And it becomes kind of like peeling an onion at the end of the thing.
That's why your middle name is Nihilist.
Yeah, exactly. No, it is loving the adversarial method. It becomes a goal in itself. So the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, some of my students may still be sitting back there, they know what I'm talking about, suggests to not start that way, even in one's professional life, without looking to this negative tearing apart, to listen to a theory first, to actually get into the theory and understand it on its own premises. And what is this theory trying to accomplish? And then we look for the flaws. And to me, that sounds like the A curve, the low difficulty curve.
Yeah, it does.
You start out by understanding, really getting into it with the other methods, but in terms of content. You really get into understanding something, and then you progress toward looking at the flaws in the theory, but you don't necessarily want to discard the theory, you just want to sort of understand it at different levels. Could that work?
I kind of like that actually.
Yeah, I kinda like it too.
I kind of like the idea of this adversarial method too. I don't talk about it. I wouldn't be surprised if there is, but I'm unaware of research on it. I'm like, I think that's kind of an interesting technique because it has some elements that I would predict would be very effective. But then I could also imagine some, and these would be not in the cognitive realm, which is more where I am, but there could also be some, emotional aspects to it for the students, right? Which some of them are going to be beneficial because it's more salient, right? They're going to pay more attention to it.
I'm teaching a fairly complex discipline, but I try to approach it from kind of, I guess, the more difficult training aspect of it, and I'll start with a highly theoretical reading, and probably way over their heads in most cases. But what I tend to do is I walk them through it. I hold their hand through the reading. So I have them read it on their own, and I give them some reading strategies. But then we actually go over it together. I'm literally, sentence by sentence, and then I introduce new concepts and introduce, discussion of new vocabulary, things like that, through the entire process of going through this reading with them. And so could that be considered kind of a hybrid of the high
Right.
end?
So
of
it's
the-
like you're
the high and
kind
low?
of you're showing them the high difficulty that's going to be expected, but you're providing them the support for that kind of stepping up kind of a method, right? And I
What
think
do you
that's
teach?
yeah,
Architecture.
Architecture.
yeah. I think that's really good.
The same thing would be the case in history, where people have to read primary sources that might be written hundreds of years ago, and yet they have to do that to get their feet wet, and so you sort of have to work both sides of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's
And
probably the
then,
same thing in philosophy, too.
and the hope is eventually they won't need that support. That's the hope, right? And I think
The
that
hope
by
they what?
that eventually they won't need that support.
Exactly.
And I think by
yeah.
having that support up front is they're more likely to actually get it and be able to achieve that end. So no, I think that's probably very good.
I felt like it was a confidence builder to a certain extent. Like if I tell them, hey, you know what, you guys read something probably more challenging than you would read in maybe even grad work. So, and you got through it. So I kind of try to approach it from that perspective, and hopefully.
Playing on those sort of those other aspects are really beneficial too. Or I like the motivation and sides.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting that the continued practice that you showed kind of provides backing and a sort of like motivation to, like, for me at least, I've had tests where I've studied more than I feel like I've ever studied for any test before, and then I have to maybe drop the class after because I did so bad on the test, and then I start to question my skills and stuff rather than my techniques, and
Right.
now this kind of gives backing to the fact that maybe it is techniques that cause problems rather than your skill. So that provides like good motivation, I think, for me and other students,
That's what good to hear.
that it's not, that it's maybe not you, that it's just your technique. So.
Mhm.
So we gotta get those personal growth courses out there, and people dig them real early.
You know what is interesting though is that if you compare, like people who do really well learning stuff and people who don't do very well learning stuff, a lot of people who do really well learning stuff are already doing some of these things. Just incidentally, they've like learned them over, just by chance, just by experience, right? And so a lot of these things actually help students who are struggling more than students who are not, right? But for sure, some of them can help anyone. And it is helpful on both sides, right? Because like you as a learner can take advantage of some of these, because you have control over a lot of these things on either end.
I think when you use the continued, or one uses the continued practice method, by the time you come to take the test, you're so overloaded with information that you don't even know how to get all this information out onto paper, or you don't know how to apply it because you have so many different thoughts that you might know a lot about this topic, but the fact that you can't connect it because you know too much almost, and that goes back to the overload, obviously. But
And you're kind of learning it in that one way. So it's kind of
Yeah,
like you can
exactly.
only retrieve it in that one way versus being able to, manipulate that information and kind of organize it and stuff. Okay, so I think that's it. I hope you guys got something out of it. I think there's extra credit sign in for some of you.
Absolutely.
Make sure you sign up for Flex by midnight for some of you. And thank you all for coming.